Hi folks, this is going to be a quick introduction to four photographers that made a name for themselves. I say in the 40s and 50s, but some of them had working lives that started during the 30s and continued on into the 60s. But it's kind of a good place to put these people. Uh, First one is Harry Callahan. And what I'd like you to know about Harry Callahan is that he um, got into a school that was started by Moholy Nagy. And Moholy Nagy was given the opportunity to open up a new Bauhaus in the United States. And Harry Callahan was somebody that went to that school, and eventually Moholy Nagy hired him to teach photography. So you'll recall that Moholy Nagy had a school of photography called New Vision, and that was to take pictures of things that people had never seen portrayed that way before. This is a very simple shot, weed in the snow. But I don't think Harry Callahan wants you to think of it as a weed in the snow. I think he wants you to see it as a piece of abstract or non-objective art that you can kind of use as a Rorschach test, and you can see different things if you look into it. Um, he was based in Chicago, so lots of cold weather. And there's something about these 6 trees that are a little bit modernistic. They just don't look like Ansel Adams trees. They have a design quality about them. And here you have a shot that was taken during a windy day and composited together so that you have the feeling of how the tree is being buffeted by the wind. And Harry wasn't afraid to go into the dark room. He wasn't afraid to manipulate pictures. So here was a negative where he was probably looking out of one of his apartment houses at another apartment house at night. And when he took the picture, then he went into the dark room and he layered it so that you get a whole different new vision type of experience. Now, he also was married to a very understanding lady and ended up using her as a model. And there will be a whole sequence of pictures about her in his collection. Um, the next fellow is Aaron Siskind. And Aaron Siskind started out in the 1930s doing FSA style of survey work. So his first pictures were in Harlem in New York City, and he was documenting, excuse me, he was documenting the way of life of the black population. This would be a opportunity to record what life was like for the African American people who came north and settled in New York City. And during the 1950s, there was a McCarthyism. There was a period of government called McCarthyism where artists who had had connections with the American Communist Party in the 1930s were called up in front of subcommittees and interrogated about their Americanism and whether they were still communist or not. When Aaron Siskin heard about this, he switched his styles. Instead of doing documentary photography, he started to do photography that was more or less influenced by abstract expressionist painters. And Robert Motherwell on the right was a person who painted large canvases with just these very simple strokes. And Siskin switched over and started to find that he could use his camera to kind of follow along in the footsteps of abstract expressionism. So this was taken in Jerome, Arizona. We have a contact with a famous photographer, and it's just paint peeling. But again, kind of like the weed in the snow, I think Aaron Siskin would invite you to see what you can see in the picture. I have been looking at Indian pottery and Indian rug weaving, and I kind of see a thunderbird in there. But that's just me, and you can make what you want of it, like a Rorschach test. Siskind also did unusual types of people photography, and he did one that was called levitation, and it was not sure if this was at a swimming pool, and I think this was at a swimming pool, and it was divers, and it was all sorts of people, but none of them were attached to the ground. So that was kind of an unusual way to do things. Robert Frank was a Swiss fashion photographer, and Europe had been devastated in the 1940s during the war. And so Robert Frank decided to try and come to New York and get into the fashion business in New York, because he had been doing some fashion work in Paris. When he arrived in New York, he had his eyes open to the fact that the United States was not like the Hollywood movies of the time period that painted a picture of the United States as rich and wealthy and full of nightclubs and singing and dancing and big cars and a lavish lifestyle. And he started to use his camera not to take fashion pictures, but to study what was going on in the 1950s. This is right after World War II. And he met Jack Kerouac. Now, Jack Kerouac is a famous beat writer, B-E-A-T. They were called beatniks, and they were kind of intellectuals. And Jack Kerouac wrote the book On the Road, which is a standard in American literature these days. But it had kind of a Dadaist feel to it. It was kind of a crazy, mixed up existence. And Robert Frank enjoyed being in with this bunch of smart people who had ways of commenting on the bad things that were happening in the United States. Robert Frank thought that America was being blinded by patriotism, and he was anti-McCarthy. He thought that the witch hunts for communist sympathizers were way out of control. And so you'll see here, this is a shot called Parade, and you'll see that the flag is kind of blocking one of the main characters in this picture. This is a far cry from a Hollywood movie where they have glamorous people eating and drinking in glamorous restaurants. These are just the working people, and he was documenting folks that were just kind of helping out and getting by. This was a shot. You can see this is a very different kind of aesthetic. It's sometimes referred to as a snapshot aesthetic, and the fact that it's very, very far removed from F64 and pre-visualization. He used a 35 millimeter camera and carried it with him every place. When he went to the South, this was pre-civil rights. When he went to the South, he was kind of fascinated but appalled at the double standard of how African American people were treated as second-class citizens, and yet they were relied on by the the white European people as domestics and people who could help to raise their children. So he got a Guggenheim Fellowship, which is a very prestigious award, which allowed him to buy a car and travel around the United States and take pictures. And the pictures became the core of this book, which was called The Americans. When he went to get a publisher, he went to New York and he peddled his book around from one publishing house to another. And people in the publishing industry were kind of appalled that he was being critical of the United States. Here was a European who was, at one point, all of Europe was threatened by Hitler being taken over, and the Americans came and they helped to liberate the people of Europe, and now you had a citizen of Europe come and take pictures that were critical of the United States, and they would not publish it. He could not find an American publisher when he first started out. What he did was he went to Europe and he found somebody in Paris that would publish the book. And during the 1960s, when the hippie movement came in, and also the question authority movement and the civil rights era, and the area of idealism and trying to get people to be treated properly, all of a sudden this book became very, very popular with the younger generation. And then it was printed in many copies and distributed. Eventually, he just put his camera aside and moved off to Nova Scotia and became a visual artist. Bill Brandt will be our last 40s and 50s photographer. He's English. He's from Germany, but settled in England and worked in England. And he started out in a documentary tradition around the coal mines in northern England. And he documented what it was like to be a miner and work in the coal fields, and just kind of like FSA photography, but this was done in England and the United Kingdom. And he published this, which was a very standard kind of documentary photography. And then came a great big switch. He started to get into fine art photography. And this is sometimes called surrealism. It has kind of a dreamlike or a halfway nightmarish kind of photography. You can see that the ear is a huge, huge kind of an ear, and the beach and the rocks seem to be small in comparison to it. So it's pretty radical camera view here, and definitely much different and unusual um, way of portraying a person. Um, this might be confused with an Edward Weston nude, but again, it has his style, it has his stamp on it, and you gotta understand that just like Aaron Siskin was influenced by the art of his time, um, Bill Brandt had to be influenced by the art of his time. Here is a piece of sculpture that is contemporary with the time period that he's taking these unusual pictures of nudes. So Barbara Hepworth was one artist that may have influenced him. And here you have pictures of some knees, again on the rocky beach with sea in the background. Uh, and then Henry Moore was a very famous sculptor in England. And you can kind of see that he probably influenced Bill Brandt as well. So those are some names, and I have an assignment for you. I'd like you to read the assignment carefully, do some research, and do some summing up. So I hope this helped you out.